I just want to say thank you, everybody, for coming to Hillside Cemetery. Hillside is now over 200 years old. Was officially established in 1818, but used by a farmer and his family before 1818. And Hillside is owned and maintained by the Wilton Congregational Church, which you know helped establish Wilton in 1726. So we are very pleased to have Bob Russell, our town historian
and church historian.
And church historian.
That's how I got my start.
Absolutely.
Just digging around in the church graveyards.
That's right. So thank you all.
Okay. Well, this is a great crowd. As Pam said, the cemetery officially became property of the Congregational Church in 1818, and it was Joe's Hill. Actually, it wasn't already owned by the church, but Joe's Hill, named after Jonathan Middlebrook, who's buried over there in the old section. And we're going to take a short walk over to the old section after we make a loop around here. And I've chosen a list of people, and some of you may have the list, of famous people that we're going to see where they're buried today. And by no means everybody that's famous is on this list, because we had to be limited to how many we could cover in 1 hour. And so we have a plan to go around a big loop, starting here at the flagpole. We're going to go over that way, and then we'll go up and zigzag up that way, and then we'll cross this road and go over here and see a couple on this side, and then back down here. We'll go over to the old section and see one or two, and then come back through there and end up at the flagpole. And if we're lucky, we can get it all done in 1 hour. So 1818, and then more was given to the church a little later. And then finally by 1918, one of the Middlebrook descendants gave a large portion of land to the church. It was a Virginia Wilkinson, who was a Middlebrook. And then later on in the 20th century, they added like 25 acres to the south. That actually came from Julian Gregory, but the money, a large portion of it, came from Charles Dana, who was a big friend of the Congregational Church, and most of the money for that purchase from Gregory came from Charles Dana. And so with that purchase, we have enough land to last 200 years.
Easily another 200 years.
Good. And
very easily.
And Pam's going to be around to watch it.
That's right.
So.
That's right.
Okay, so we'll start at the flagpole because there's a nice monument at the base of the flagpole honoring our men that we lost in World War I and II. It's the green marker. And you'll see James Whipple on there, who was our only World War I casualty. He's not buried here. He's buried in France. But the other men are buried, 4 of them are buried here at Hillside. And the 4 are Bertrand Evans, who's in one of the markers there next to the flagpole. David Keeler, I think he's up in the Keeler plot up there. We have some Keeler family members here. We're going to make sure we stop and look at that plot. Willis DeForest and Henry Shriver. So those are the 4 World War II casualties who died in the war.
One or two? World War
II.
Right.
We only lost 1 Wilton man in World War I, and it was James Whipple,
Right.
after whom the American Legion Post is named, the James Whipple Post. And we'll see where the Whipple family is buried, but he's buried over in Europe. Okay, so there's another important marker there, and it's Joe Hopkins. And I think maybe it's the one behind the green marker. We have to look.
Yes.
And Joe lived until 1980. That's Joseph. Yeah, that's Joe. Joseph Hopkins. He died in 1980. And he was a commander of an LST landing ship that landed at Iwo Jima very early in the battle for Iwo Jima. And you know the famous picture of the men raising the flag on Iwo Jima. They went up there. Thank you. They went up there with a flag and stuck it in the ground and decided it wasn't big enough. So they came down to the ship and went to the ship captain, who was Joe Hopkins, said, "You have a better flag, a bigger flag." "Yes," he said, "I have one that's 8 feet long, 4.5 feet high, and you can have it." So that flag went up and was put up on the pole at the top of Iwo Jima. That's the one you see in all the pictures.
Really?
It was Joe Hopkins' ship flag. So that's his claim to fame. And I knew Joe Hopkins, a very nice man. When he died in 1980, it was interesting. The caption on his obituary said, "Joe Hopkins, sewer administrator." I thought they could have thought of something nicer to say about him in the headlines, but then the whole article describes his participation in World War II and the fact that he had the LST ship, and it was his flag that went up on the top of Iwo Jima.
Bob, can I interject something?
Sure.
Hi, I'm Bill Glass, American Legion Post
Hi,
Commander.
Bill. Yeah.
And thank you for doing this. This is wonderful. I just want to add something about Lieutenant Commander Hopkins. The flag is now on display at the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, Virginia, behind a special enclosed case.
Good.
And they have a guard next to it.
Good.
And they don't even permit flash photography. And you have to go one at a time to actually view the flag.
Well, do they
It's amazing.
give any credit to Joe Hopkins? I was afraid of that. Shucks. I'm going to look for George Abbott. He's here somewhere. Right there. That one. Yes. George Abbott. George Abbott was a blacksmith up on Hurlbut Street. And if you look at the front cover of the Wilton book, there's a nice red barn in that picture of Hurlbut Street, and that was George Abbott's barn. And who knows where that barn is now? No,
Lambert House?
no, not the Lambert House, the Betts House. So the main headquarters of the Historical Society has George Abbott's barn and blacksmith shop out back. The reason I wear this glove is because this crusty stuff grows on the grave and the marker. You just take a glove, you can scrape it off. If you let it stay on for too long, it starts ruining the stone. George's wife was Lovisa Smith with a V, not a U, Lovisa. And she was, I'm gonna
Want me to hold this?
yeah, I'm gonna have to throw something. No, I better hold that. She was actually an aunt of Walt Smith, our famous builder and contractor of the Historical Society. Walt was responsible for moving and rebuilding many of the buildings that we have on Historical Society property.
Bob,
Yeah.
is that relation to Blanche Smith too?
Oh yeah, Blanche was one of
The sisters?
an aunt.
The aunt.
She was an aunt of Walt.
No, I knew that, but I mean, is this Lovisa?
No, Lovisa was, I think, on the other side of the family,
Oh,
or not one of his father's sisters, but she was an aunt of Walt, maybe a great aunt. Okay, so here we have some Otavis, some Myers, a Denslow, and a woman whose name isn't even on a stone. But the Meyer brothers, Charles and Fritz is up here, were the great builders in Wilton in the early 1900s. They built the center school in 1929. They built a number of other buildings that are still standing from that period. They had a big mill, some of you will remember. It was down on the river at the end of Wolf Pit, and the state tore it down when they made plans for building Super 7 up through here. And it was a great old mill building. I remember going in there. And his family carried on the mill business for a while after the building was torn down, but then they went into other events. And so Fritz's wife, is her name on there? Bridget, here we are. Bridget, she was the maid of the Schenck family. When the Schenck families moved to town in 1911, they brought a young German woman named Bridget, and I forget the last name, but she married Fritz Meyer. Fritz was a World War I veteran, and so they raised a number of children. One was Mary Ellen Otavi, you'll remember her. Kathleen Denslow was another one of the family. She married a Denslow. And there are some other Otavis buried around here. William was in the Navy in Vietnam. He wasn't killed in Vietnam, he survived Vietnam. But it was a great family in town. I think it's...
Denslow, you know, the W.W. Denslow was an artist.
Oh, I don't think there's any relation to the Wilton Denslow.
No, there is, because
There is?
the guy came in, Clark Denslow came in before he moved, and he said that was his grandfather.
Oh, well, I
So
didn't
that-
even know that.
Yeah,
Good,
yeah.
good. Okay, this is Henry Thompson. Get a little of that.
H.C. Thompson, the artist? Yeah.
H.C. Thompson, the artist. So I'm glad some people remember him. He lived in what is now Wilton Arms for 50 years, like 1880 to 1930, and maybe until 1938, whenever he died, whatever it says on the stone, 37. And he was a well-known artist. In fact, his paintings are worth a lot of money.
We have two.
You have two.
Yes, we
I
do.
have one.
Oh, oh.
It cost us a bunch of money. I'll tell you who has more.
Oh, we know, we know.
We won't tell anybody, 'cause we might all go steal them from him. But very collectible, beautiful, beautiful works. Of many of them are Wilton scenes. And then we have, I think, a wife, and then one of his daughters married Bob Pete. If you remember, he was a civic leader in the 1960s, and so he's buried on down this row, along with his wife. And then if you go far enough, you get to the Whipple family. And I told you, James Whipple, World War I hero, after the Elysian Post is named, was buried in Europe, but his family is down there on that side. Okay, Angie Post is up here, and I'm not even sure there's a marker for her, but that's the Post family. Her father's name was Washington Post. And they lived on Washington Post Road. Where else? Up off of Grumman Hill. House is no longer there. I don't think there's a marker for Angie. Nope, just a big one here for the family. And more like them on the stone. Okay, so then we have over here, we're going to look for the Raymonds. This is the one I want. Yep. In the Wilton book, I did a little page and a half on the Comstock family. And there's a nice picture in the book of several generations of the Comstock family. And the old lady in the picture was Clarissa Raymond, who married a Comstock. And in the picture, you have her daughter, her grandson, his children, and his grandchildren. So she had great-great-grandchildren when she died at 104. And it says that on here somewhere. Wife of Samuel Raymond.
It says 104.
Yeah,
Yeah.
104.
Yeah, right there.
Okay, so she was well known, not famous outside of Wilton, but well known. Okay, now let's see, if we go over here, I think we'll find Gifford Proctor. People remember Gifford Proctor?
Another artist.
Another artist.
One of our best customers. We own the
There's a Proctor.
Keeler hardware. Mickey's a Keeler.
Here he is, Gifford Proctor. He lived in his last few years up on Sealy Road in a small building next to Sylvia Kaiser's house on Sealy. And his lifetime work was a sculpture of George Washington at Valley Forge. And you'll see pictures of it. There's a model of it in the front of the lobby in Middlebrook School. It's like a 10 or 12-foot model of it. It never got cast into metal and installed at Valley Forge, which was his hope that it would. But then when they shipped it off to the foundry, I think it fell apart. And brought the remains of it back home and never actually finished it. But he must have spent 45 years, and that's really the thing he was most famous for. And in his older years, he didn't have much money, so he had been a longtime friend of Sylvia Kaiser, so she said, well, here, you can live in my garage, or actually a little outbuilding next to her.
And his father was a famous sculptor.
Yes, yes.
Right.
Yeah, Alexander Phimister Proctor, who lived in Wilton on Hurlbut Street, and his house is still here, and I have a painting of it, which I'll give to the Historical Society someday. And he was a artist of the West, Alexander Phimister Proctor. There's a wonderful sculpture in the Wilton Library of man on horseback, Indian on horseback. It's Alexander Phimister Proctor's. I hope that's still in the library.
Oh, it is? No, it is.
It's pretty heavy.
Yes, it is.
And he was quite a bit older. Gifford was born in 1906, but his father was in his late 40s, maybe 50s by the time he was born. Gifford had a number of older siblings. And father was most of his life in the West, but in his later years he moved to Wilton. When we interviewed Gifford in 2000 for the 2002 documentary on Wilton, Gifford starts out by saying, my first memories are waking up in a tent in the mountains because father lived out in the wilds, and so he spent his first few years out in the West. Gifford was an interesting man. He was a local builder before the Meyer brothers. And you've heard about Cottage Row, the row of little cottage houses that used to be down there across from the library along Old Ridgefield Road. George Taylor built a lot of those. And his own house was in the front of the village market, which is now the parking lot for the village market. George Taylor's house was there. Walt Smith tore it down when he built the village market because, you know, it was a nice little cottage. But it also was the first home of the Wilton Library. You probably knew that.
I didn't.
Where his home was?
Yeah, for a few years until they found a better place, which I believe was in Henry Thompson's studio building. So Henry Thompson, who we just saw, was also a host of the Wilton Library for a few years till they got their own building in 1918. So George also built the Big Red Barn up at Ambler Farm. If you go up to Ambler and drive up the hill, there's a stone there, I think it says 1899. That was a George Taylor thing. And he did a lot of work for the Ambler family. He didn't build the White Barn, it was at least 20 years earlier. But he built a lot of the outbuildings that are there, probably the Ice House, and did work on the White House, a lot of work at Ambler Farm. So he died about 1939. And the Meyer brothers, by then, had taken over most of the construction business in Wilton. Schlichting. And they don't have any individual markers, but there are a lot of Schlichting family members here. And of course, you probably all remember Ann Schlichting. She was cashier in the village market for 40 years, from 1941 to 1981, and very good at it. Never married, lived in the family home where she was born in 1910 until she died in 2005, 2006 or thereabouts. She was in her mid-90s when she died. And her only survivors are niece and nephew, and they both still live in Wilton. But there are no individual names here honoring these people. Schlichting family, of course, lived next door in the house that was torn down just a couple of years ago. Beautiful old Victorian. And I was in there many times. In fact, at one point we thought we might be able to make a historic district out of it. And Anne was willing, but her niece and nephew were not. They wanted to sell it because they had been supporting Anne for years and they didn't have any other source of income, so they sold it to Feber, and then Feber was going to build various kinds of developments. And an arrangement was made where the Wilton Land Trust, in combination with the Historical Society and Woodcock and somebody else, would Chestnut, yeah, would make use of the property if we're able to close the deal. But it's still pending because they're depending on a state grant. And you can keep your fingers crossed. I don't know if they'll ever get that state grant. And if they don't, then I don't know what will happen. But of course, it's beautiful, 13 acres right next to the cemetery. And the Schlichting families had many years association with the cemetery. Carol Schlichting, the son, or I guess he was a brother of Anne, yeah, was the cemetery maintenance man for years. Yeah. You may not have heard of this man, Richard Daggy.
Another artist.
He was an artist, you knew it.
I do.
Yes, Richard Daggy was an artist who painted Wilton scenes. There's a wonderful picture of the old mill that used to be on the Comstock Brook behind the Congregational Church. It was torn down in 1938 because it was no longer stable. There's another wonderful painting of his of Jesse's gas station, which used to be where Old Ridgefield Road came out onto Route 7. Well, when they rebuilt everything in 1941 and made the bridge over to Route 7, the road through Wilton Center became dead end, and the gas station went out of business, maybe even before that. But there's a wonderful painting of that gas station. The Norwalk Historical Society owns it. Okay, here we have the Degner family. Paul Degner and his wife, Lois Ann Degner. Oh, no, I'm sorry. She married Brown. Paul Degner was, I guess, Lois Ann's father. And he married a Martin. We're going to get to the Martins next, they're behind. Paul Degner married a Martin. And their daughter, Lois Ann, married Brown. And Lois Ann Degner's family, mainly Lois Ann, owned what is now Quarryhead off Ridgefield Road. And Nancy Fazy knew Lois Ann. When did she die? Fairly recently. And Nancy negotiated with her that the state of Connecticut would buy that property and the town of Wilton would maintain it. So that's the way it is. You can go visit Quarryhead anytime you want, if you can find it. There used to be a marker on Ridgefield Road. It keeps disappearing. It's between two little houses and a little narrow road that goes down there in a beautiful high site where you can see Long Island Sound when there aren't too many leaves out. And they left the chimney of the house. Part of the deal was they have to take the house down. They didn't want people tramping through the house. So the house, beautiful house, is gone. But it's a public park area. Terry Goodwin. Remember Terry Goodwin has an attachment to that. Larry Goodwin used to maintain the Quarryhead property for years, and Terry still pays a lot for the maintenance of the Quarryhead property. Now, I mentioned the name there, Martin. Mary Martin married Lois Ann's Colony Hill. Mary Martin was a daughter of Edward Sanford Martin, and this was his wife. And I think there are a lot of names on the back of this stone. Well, it's just a description. Here are the names. Oh my, she was the mother of George Martin, Mary Degner, Lois Blagden, grandmother of Lois Ann Degner, and a whole bunch of other people. Edward Martin's claim to fame is he founded the original Life magazine. And before that, when he was at Harvard, he founded the Harvard Lampoon. He was a great writer. He wrote articles for many publications, including his own Life magazine. And he was well known and, of course, died a long time ago, I think in the 1930s. His son I believe, spoke at a historical society meeting not terribly long ago, because I remember meeting one of the Martin family. So he was, you know, a really important person in Wilton. Okay, so now I could keep going that way. The Amblers are up there, a lot of other people, but we're going to go over and see Dr. Turner.
Get that in there?
And this is his monument. He was a doctor. Yeah. Joseph Edward Turner. He was J. Edward Turner. What the plaque says, he was the founder and medical superintendent of the first inebriate asylum in the world at Binghamton, New York, where they treated alcoholics. It was not called alcoholism in those days, so it was called an inebriate asylum. And he managed that. He founded it, he managed it for a few years, but by 1866, the board of directors up there thought he was being too harsh on the inmates, the residents, because his treatment of alcoholism was absolute withdrawal, which is what we do today. And having some family experience with that, it doesn't work unless the patient is willing to make it work. And these patients at Binghamton were saying, oh, I'd like to have a drink before dinner. And so they were connected to members of the board, and the board of the Binghamton Hospital fired Dr. Turner. They said, you're too tough on these patients because you won't let them have a drink before dinner. So they brought in somebody else, and within a few years the whole thing failed, as you might expect. So Dr. Turner came to Wilton, and his connection to Wilton was he married a Middlebrook. The Middlebrook family, at that point, there were 9 girls and 1 man in the family. And the girls all married well. Well, Daddy had a lot of money. The Middlebrooks came to Wilton, the first Middlebrook, in the 1750s. And they brought all the land where Middlebrook Farm Road is now. They owned clear over to Route 7. They owned an awful lot of land, because if you had money in the mid-1700s, what did you do? You bought land. It was a good investment. And it still is, I think. Just don't buy a house. So anyhow, the Middlebrook ladies had all married pretty well-to-do husbands. And so Dr. Turner came back to Wilton. He said, I will start a hospital for women inebriates, because the one in Binghamton was men only. And he realized women drank too. So if you have my book, you will find a picture of this wonderful 4-story tall, 300-foot long building that Dr. Turner planned to build up at the end of what's now Middlebrook Farm Road. It's at the point where Catalpa and Turner Ridge and Middlebrook Farm Road all come together. Those are all dead end up there, and there's an area in the middle. It was all open land and no trees and bushes like you have now. And so he, through the family, decided he would build a hospital for women inebriates. And he went around raising money. He started the project probably in about 1870. He went around raising money, and by 1881, he was going all over the state and even part of the country. By 1881, he had enough money to break ground. There was a report in the newspaper. By that time, the Ridgefield Press had been established, and they covered Wilton news. And so it's a great way to learn about, you know, Wilton activities in the late 1800s. You read the Ridgefield Press, and most of that's online now too. So it talked about the dedication ceremony in 1881 for the hospital. He broke ground, had a big celebration. And then his enemies up in Binghamton went back to the regulatory authorities in the state of Connecticut and said, this guy's a crook. He's a cheat. He's a fake. He doesn't know what he's doing. And as an example, they proved bad things that happened at Binghamton. And so they revoked his license. And he couldn't build the hospital. Gave the money back to the donors, many of whom were his wife's brother-in-laws. And he died unhappy. And Dr. Turner lived next door in what became the Schlichting House in the late 1800s. But he lived next door until he died in 1889. So 20 years later, the American Medical Society in 1909 put up this plaque. And as you can see, the first physician to put into practical operation the treatment of inebriety as a disease. By the methods he instituted, thousands have been redeemed, humanity blessed, the principles of Christianity advanced. And so they put this up in 1909. Poor man never lived to see it, but a lot of his family members are around here. And you'll see Joseph Edward Turner. Madeline was a daughter. She used to give talks at the Historical Society. And it's too bad that didn't happen.
Is he buried here or not?
Yeah, he's buried here. I think the original burial just had this marker, and in 1909 they added this top. So,
Kind of tragic.
yeah, he's one of our most famous residents of Hillside Cemetery. So the three generations of Keelers here, the one that started the general store in Wilton is back there. His son Raymond started the hardware store, and grandson Robert, who was Mickey's father, carried on the hardware business. Probably went to Florida 25 years ago. I don't know,
Yeah, over 30 years.
30 years ago.
Yes.
And he just died last year. So, and then you found several other generations of Keelers down the hill.
Yeah, we think Mickey's got at least 7 generations here, maybe 8.
Wow. Well, there are 3 right here.
Right, 3 right here, and the rest are just over the hill. down
Yeah,
there.
because there were big Keeler houses up on Ridgefield Road. When you make the turn, the big one on the top with the columns, which were added later after the Keelers lived there. And then farther on, where Keeler Ridge takes off, that house on the corner dates to like 1740. It's a very early house. So there were Keelers up there too. So let's see. If we went back farther back there, Peter Johnson, who was killed in Vietnam, was back in that area. And instead, I think we'll walk down here. We'll go by the huge Betts monument, the tallest one here. There were lots of Betts families. And then we'll end up over on the other side next to the Comstocks. Oh, another artist, Ben Friends.
Oh,
He did Saturday evening cover posts
Ridgefield Road.
up on Ridgefield Road. Yeah, he died in 1980. Yeah. He was a friend of Norman Rockwell, and at one point Norman Rockwell came down and stayed with him for a while, and the girl next door modeled for Norman Rockwell, and she was in some of Rockwell's paintings.
Sharon Bailey. Sharon Bailey.
Yeah.
She was a classmate of mine.
Oh, good.
Yeah. I always thought she made that story up. But
Well, maybe she did, but that's where I heard it.
that's where you got it.
Good. Good. Alfred. Yeah. Samuel Comstock was the most famous of the Comstock family. He was a major in the Revolutionary War. He and Meade, Matthew Meade, were our 2 highest ranking officers in the Revolutionary War. And Meade isn't buried here, but the Comstocks originally, Samuel and these are, I believe, his parents. And that was not old, but the old monuments originally were up in the Comstock Cemetery, which is where, what's the name of the road that goes up the hill off Ridgefield Road and comes back down again? Signal Hill. Yeah, at the north end of Signal Hill Road, where it comes back out onto Ridgefield Road, there's an old cemetery. And some of you have probably discovered it. It's back in the woods.
Is it on the corner?
Yeah, it's on the corner. It's now owned by the Wilton Land Trust, so it's safe. And there are probably 300 graves in there. And it started with the Comstock family. And so there were 7 Comstocks buried up there by the early 1900s, and nobody was maintaining the cemetery. And they couldn't round up enough Comstocks that were willing to take care of it. So they dug them up and moved them down here.
Whoa!
At least they moved the monuments.
Were there markers in there then?
Oh yeah, there's still some markers. There are a lot of markers left up there.
Hard to read.
Yeah, they're old. It hasn't been, nobody's been buried there for 150 years. So there are a number of veterans, Revolutionary veterans up there. And there are a lot of graves that are only marked with a vertical flagstone. And the reason is, for 50 years, from 1800 to 1850, the town leased for $5 a year, I guess, leased the right to bury the town poor at the Comstock Cemetery. So as a result, there are probably 150 graves that are totally unmarked. And we have no idea who's there because there was no town record keeping of deaths or burials, unless they were church members. And even then, it probably didn't say where they were buried. So as a result, about 150 unmarked graves up there. And periodically, the DAR group does some restoration work, cuts things down and brightens up the place. And that's fine with the land trust because we don't have the manpower to do that. And they've taken good care of it. They've remounted some of the markers that have fallen over. And as I said, there are at least a half a dozen Revolutionary veterans buried up there. Still, even after the Comstocks pulled out. Okay, here's Wilbur with the flag.
Wilbur Morgan?
Yep. Wilbur Morgan was seriously injured at Gettysburg, battle in July of 1863, and he came home and he died in August of 63. And it's interesting because he's the only one that we know who was essentially killed in the Civil War, who was buried here. He was mortally wounded and came home and was buried here. And interestingly enough, in our archives, we have a couple of letters that Wilbur wrote to his friends before all this happened. He was writing back to the friends, how is so-and-so, and I miss the town, and here's what we're doing now, and this kind of thing. A couple of nice letters. And so he ended up here. One of the many that we lost in the Civil War. The monument down at the Veterans Memorial, the tallest one, of course, of the Civil War casualties. She started the Yankee Fair.
This is who? Justine?
Justine Milliken, yeah.
A great friend.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I remember her.
She
Yeah.
sold us
She was a hard worker.
Wonderful
And her
person.
big contribution to, Arch was her husband, big contribution to the Yankee Fair was the antiques sale. They would go up to New Hampshire and Vermont and buy antiques, bring them down, refinish them in the basement of what's now the private school down the road. Used to be the church religious education building, and then they sold them at the fair. But that business kind of dried up because the price of the antiques went up. People were buying things online. Young people don't want that stuff, so that business just died. But that was her main
It was a
contribution.
big deal at the time.
It was a big deal.
Made
The
a
an-
lot of money.
Yeah, because the book sale was a tiny part of the
Right.
Yankee Fair. Harvey Gosley ran the book sale. That's how I got my start in book sales, from Harvey. Okay, somewhere here we have General Charles West. Charles West, he was our highest ranking Army person. Served in Korea, Vietnam. I never knew him. All I know is he had a big ego. Anybody know Charles West? Lived up on Ridgefield
Yeah, I
Road.
knew him. I met him.
Up near the end of Ridgefield Road. Big ego?
Yeah. But nice enough guy.
Yeah, nice enough. Well, that's good. Okay, now we have to go over to the old section of the cemetery, not too far. This part of the cemetery was the only cemetery for many years until they got the additional land over there in 1918. And so most of the Revolutionary veterans, except for Comstock, are buried over in this section. And the stones are all pretty much the same shape. Jonathan Middlebrook, after whom Joe's Hill Cemetery is named, is one of these over here. I think the one that's flat on the ground. And he was an early patriot. I think he was probably too old to fight in the war. This man, William Wakeman, was really the founder of the abolition group in Wilton, pre-Civil War. William Wakeman died in 1881, born 1798, 1790. Is that a three?
It's a 3.
That's a 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a 3. Died in 1881. And starting in the 1830s, Connecticut was forming an anti-slavery society, an abolition group. And they sent a preacher down to speak at the Georgetown Baptist Church. And he gave a very, vibrant sermon against slavery. And it was so interesting, he did it a second night, and then he was going to do it a third night. But the people who were not in favor of an anti-slavery movement put a keg of gunpowder in there and blew up the church. And it was reported in the Norwalk papers. Didn't even have a Ridgefield paper in 1838, but it was the Norwalk Sentinel that published it, and we have a printout of the article. And of course it's mentioned in the book that the church was blown up. They were able to rebuild the church. The anti-slavery society continued, but the preacher went away from Wilton, and Georgetown said it's the most anti-slavery place in the North. He couldn't believe the feelings. And a lot of them were people like Danbury hat makers that did a lot of business with the South. And they didn't want to lose the slavery business. So anyhow, the society continued. And Wakeman was the president of the Anti-Slavery Society for several years. And at his house on Sealy Road, it was a station for the Underground Railroad. And in the book, there's a picture of part of the tunnel that went out from his house, where the slaves would travel at night underground, get out onto a wagon, and cover them up with straw, took them up somewhere else in Connecticut and passed them on to somebody else. Don't know how many slaves escaped that way, but quite a number. And Wakeman's house still stands. It's right on Sealy Road, where the road makes a sharp turn. It's up on the hill behind a lot of bushes. A woman named Workman owns it. She lives in the city, comes out on weekends. It's a beautiful property. There's a swimming pool and a pond and a wonderful garden out back and a huge green barn and 2 cottages nearby. I think they tore one of them down. But it's a wonderful property, and I often wondered what's going to happen to that. After Wakeman, there were a number of people lived there. One of the Sturgis men lived there. He was a butcher, and then he took veterinary training and became a veterinarian. And then he took medical training and became a medical doctor. So that's quite a career. And then there were other well-known people that lived there. John Gregg, I think his name was. He developed the Gregg shorthand. And so he named his house the Ovals. And so it ended up, the Resch family lived there. We remember the Resches in the 1960s. 70s time frame. They had 5 boys. And so now Mrs. Workman owns it, and who knows what's going to happen to it. It's a beautiful house, though. Adelina. I knew Adelina, only by telephone. Adelina B. Whitlock Gorham. Her final husband was named Gorham.
Gorham?
She just died in 08. And Tom Adams was her attorney. And her claim to fame is She was the last Whitlock in Wilton. Her father had a school, his father had a school, her great-uncle, uncle and great-uncle had schools, like 4 different Whitlock academies in Wilton. And private schools, and also more training if some kid wanted to get trained so he could go to college. There were a number of Whitlock schools. I tried to write about them in the book. Most of them burned down. We don't know if the kids started the fires, but most of them burned down. And the final Whitlock, her grandfather, and well, actually her father carried the school on for a while, but she had a wonderful desk, a roll-top desk that's now at the Wilton Historical Society, thanks to Tom Adams.
Oh, really? I have one.
Thanks. We'll keep dropping that. So it's at the Wilton Historical Society from Adelina B. Whitlock Gorham. I said to Tom once, she's living upstate with a daughter, I said, maybe we ought to go visit Adelina. I think I'd like to meet her. Sure. So I wrote her a note. She said, well, give me a call. So I gave her a call. She said, well, if you came up now, we'd have to meet in the bathroom because I have a problem. So I never met her. But Tom made sure that we got that desk for the Historical Society. Okay. Okay, now we go right over here. We look for Taylor. A while ago we talked about George Taylor, who was a big builder in Wilton. Here's James Taylor. Died in 1899.
Was he a builder?
He was an undertaker. He was Wilton's most famous undertaker. He listed his profession as cabinet maker. Well, he built a lot of cabinets. And he was in business for 50 years, from 1850 to 99. And he died in December. Earlier that year, he was quoted as saying, I have buried more people in Wilton than the current population. You know, somewhat over 2,000 people he had buried over this 50-year period. And so it was more than the current population of Wilton.
Where did he live?
On Route 7, Danbury Road, one of the houses that disappeared down where the car dealer is, and the space a couple of spaces next door that used to have houses, and even at the end of the old Wolf Pit Road where the gas station used to be years ago.
Yeah.
Taylor was along in there somewhere. It's fun to track where they used to live and see what evidence you can still find. Christopher Collier, who grew up in Wilton and was our state historian for many years, was a personal friend of Martin Fickey. Kit Collier was a little bit younger, too young for World War II, but Martin Fickey, his friend, was Wilton's first Eagle Scout. He was just a wonderful, outstanding young man, and he was killed in World War II, and he is our only, that we know of, Wilton man buried in Arlington Cemetery. So that's Martin's distinction. This is the grave of his parents. His parents were both deaf and dumb. They were mute.
Really?
Yet Martin grew up to be such a wonderful young man, according to Kit Collier. They were good friends.
Down
So-
at Wilton Center, they had a house.
Yeah, that's right. I think on Godfrey Place. But anyhow, this is the grave of Martin's parents.
Did they have other children?
I think there's a brother. And when we dedicated the Veterans Memorial thing in 2010, Veterans Day, we had somebody impersonating Mrs. Fickey, even though we knew she was deaf and dumb. Nobody else knew that. We had somebody impersonating her and say, my son Martin was an Eagle Scout, he enlisted, this is what he did in the war, and he's buried in Arlington. So it was one of the wonderful tributes on that day. So here are his parents. Okay, so now before we go up too far, if you look down the hill, maybe when we get to the road, I put a couple of stakes in with little ribbons on top. And we're not going to walk all the way down there, but there's one on this side. It's a tall stake, probably behind those trees, has a red ribbon on it. And it's the grave of John King, who was a black man who was one of our 3 or 4 black men that served in the Civil War. He's buried down here. And over on the other side, I think I can see it. Maybe there's again a post with a ribbon on top, and you can walk down later and look at it. That's a man named oh my God. Yeah, Stephen Thayer. And his inscription, he wasn't in any war, or maybe he was, but nothing notable. His inscription was, "I shook hands with Abraham Lincoln and refused to drink with Grant." That's what it said.
Yay for him. That's written here, you can see that?
Yeah, that's all it says on his stone, except for his name. Stephen Thayer. Ambrose Lockwood married one of the Betts girls. Then her sister married a Middlebrook. And so in 1880, the big scandal was his wife ran off with her sister's husband.
Really?
They just took off. And we're seen one more time over in Brewster, New York, eating ice cream on a porch, and they didn't know how they were going to support themselves because neither one of them had any money. But they never came back to Wilton. So poor Ambrose had to raise the kids, and he's here, and his wife is I don't know where. And I'm in touch with Bill Sterling, who is a descendant of the Middlebrook family, and he said Charles, I think, was the Middlebrook that ran off with Ambrose's wife. He said he never came back to Wilton, and I don't know where he is. So that was the end of that story, but poor Ambrose is here. And Mrs. Middlebrook is buried down there somewhere, the one who was abandoned by her husband.
So it was his brother?
No, the 2 women were sisters.
Oh, okay.
And so his wife went off with her
His wife,
sister's
right.
husband. Harry A. Comstock. Where's Pam? Right here. Used to be, and maybe still, at the church annual meeting, they were required to read a portion of Carrie Comstock's will.
Yes.
Because when she died, she wrote a provision in her will that she would stop paying the $10 a year to pay for the maintenance of her grave if you didn't read a portion of my will at the annual meeting every year. So that's Carrie.
And it's still read every year.
Are you still getting the $10?
Okay, well that's it. I could go on for another hour, but I've already run over by 10 minutes. So any other questions? Thank you.